It's not the exhaustion of doing too much. It's the exhaustion of feeling too much. You absorb everyone's mood the moment you walk into a room. You carry arguments that aren't yours long after they've ended. You replay someone else's bad day until it somehow becomes your own. You care deeply, automatically, almost involuntarily. And lately, that caring has started to feel less like a gift you give the world, and more like a leak you can't find the source of. Maybe that's why you've started wondering what life would feel like if you cared a little less. Not because you want to stop loving the people who matter to you, but because you're tired of bleeding every time they're in pain. You're tired of losing entire days to a conversation that lasted 5 minutes. You want some kind of boundary, some kind of skin between your heart and everyone else's emotional weather. And here's where it gets complicated, because the moment you start wanting that, a second fear shows up right behind it. What if detaching means becoming someone cold? What if protecting yourself is just the first step toward becoming someone who doesn't feel anything at all, the kind of person who watches suffering, theirs or anyone else's, from a safe, hollow distance? You don't want that. You've seen people like that, and something in you recoils at the thought of becoming one of them. This is the actual tension worth understanding today, because almost everyone gets this wrong in one of two directions. They either stay so porous that other people's emotions run through them like weather through an open window, or they build a wall so complete that nothing gets in anymore, including the things they actually wanted. Neither of those is the answer. There is a third option, one psychologists have studied under several different names, and it looks nothing like either extreme. It looks like having a heart that's fully open and fully yours at the same time, which sounds like a contradiction until you understand the actual mechanism behind it. Picture the specific version of this most people recognize immediately. A friend calls upset about something that happened at work, and within minutes you notice your own jaw has tightened. Your own thoughts have started rehearsing arguments on their behalf. Your own evening has quietly rearranged itself around a problem that an hour ago you didn't even know existed. You hang up eventually, having said all the right, comforting things. And yet something in your chest doesn't settle for hours, sometimes days. You didn't just hear about their bad day. You somehow inherited it fully, as though it had been transferred directly into your own nervous system without either of you ever agreeing to that exchange. That specific wordless transfer, so automatic you rarely notice it happening in real time, is the entire phenomenon this conversation is going to unpack. Let's start with a distinction almost nobody makes clearly, and once you see it, you'll notice it everywhere in your own life. There's a difference between empathy and fusion, and most people who describe themselves as too sensitive, too caring, too easily affected by everyone around them aren't actually experiencing too much empathy. They're experiencing fusion, and the two feel almost identical from the inside while being fundamentally different processes underneath. Empathy is the capacity to accurately perceive what someone else is feeling while remaining clearly aware that it belongs to them. You can sit with a grieving friend, feel the weight of their grief in the room, understand it with real precision, and still know somewhere steady underneath the feeling that this is their loss, not yours, that you are a witness to it rather than a second casualty of it. Fusion is different. Fusion is the collapse of that boundary entirely, where their feeling doesn't just register in you. It becomes you indistinguishable from your own internal state, so completely absorbed that you can no longer locate where their experience ends and your own begins. This distinction explains something that confuses a lot of deeply caring people. Why does supporting someone you love sometimes leave you feeling nourished, closer, more alive, and other times leave you feeling completely hollowed out, days behind on your own life, unable to explain exactly what happened? The difference almost never lives in how much you cared. It lives in whether you stayed a separate person while caring, or whether you disappeared into the other person's emotional state entirely, mistaking that disappearance for love because it felt, in the moment, like the deepest possible form of connection. It's worth pausing on why that mistake feels so convincing from the inside, because understanding the illusion makes it far easier to catch in real time. Total fusion produces an intense, almost overwhelming sense of closeness, a feeling that nothing separates you from the other person at all. And intensity gets mistaken for depth constantly in emotional life, not just here, but intensity and depth are actually different qualities entirely. A brief, all-consuming fusion can feel more powerful in the moment than years of steady, differentiated closeness. The same way a flash flood feels more dramatic than a river that's been quietly, reliably running for decades. Only one of those two things, though, is actually built to last, and only one of them leaves the surrounding landscape intact rather than eroded after it passes through. Here's the psychological concept that explains why this happens, and it comes from a framework called differentiation, developed originally to study families but useful for understanding almost any close relationship. Differentiation describes the capacity to remain a clear, separate individual, with your own thoughts and feelings intact, even while deeply connected to someone else, even under emotional pressure, even in the middle of someone else's crisis. People with low differentiation tend to experience closeness and separateness as opposites, believing, usually without ever consciously deciding this, that real intimacy requires losing themselves entirely in the other person's experience. People with higher differentiation experience closeness and separateness as compatible, capable of staying fully present with someone else's pain, without that pain overwriting their own internal state. This is worth sitting with because it reframes the entire question you've probably been asking yourself. You don't actually need less empathy. You need more differentiation. The goal was never to care less. It was to build a self solid enough that caring doesn't require dissolving. So where does low differentiation come from? Because almost nobody is born this porous. Usually it traces back to an environment, often an early one, where your own emotional state was directly tied to someone else's, where a parent's mood dictated the emotional weather of the entire household, where your job, consciously or not, became managing that weather before it managed you. Children raised in environments like this become extraordinarily skilled at reading emotional shifts in other people, sometimes before the other person has even consciously registered the shift themselves. This skill looks like empathy from the outside, and in some ways it is a form of empathy, but it was built for a specific purpose: survival, monitoring the emotional climate of someone more powerful than you in order to stay safe within it. That purpose doesn't disappear once you grow up and leave that environment. The scanning continues, now aimed at partners, friends, co-workers, anyone whose mood might shift the emotional temperature of a room you're standing in. This is why so many people who describe themselves as highly sensitive or deeply empathic also describe a specific, disorienting exhaustion, one that has less to do with genuinely caring about others and more to do with an inability to stop monitoring them. Genuine empathy, the differentiated kind, is tiring in the way meaningful things are. Tiring, but it replenishes something even as it costs something. Fusion is tiring in a completely different way. The way constant vigilance is tiring because underneath the caring, there's an old wordless belief still running in the background that someone else's emotional state is somehow your responsibility to manage. And that belief never actually rests, even in relationships where nothing is currently wrong. There's a connection worth drawing here to attachment research, because the same early environments that produce low differentiation also tend to shape a specific attachment pattern, one where closeness and anxiety become almost inseparable. If love in your early experience was conditional on how well you managed someone else's emotional state, your nervous system likely learned to treat any sign of another person's distress as a kind of alarm, something requiring immediate action to restore safety. This alarm response doesn't announce itself as anxiety in any obvious way. It simply feels like caring, like responsibility, like the natural thing any decent person would do when someone they love is struggling. But underneath that caring often sits something more specific. A fear that if you don't fix, soothe, or absorb the other person's distress quickly enough, something worse will happen. The relationship will fracture. The person will withdraw. The safety you depend on will disappear. This helps explain why simply telling someone with this pattern to care less rarely works and often makes things worse by adding shame to an already exhausting cycle. The caring was never really optional in the way advice like that implies. It was a survival response, deeply practiced, activated automatically the moment another person's distress enters the room. Real change doesn't come from suppressing that response through willpower. It comes from teaching the nervous system slowly, through repeated evidence that the old alarm is no longer accurate, that you can witness someone else's distress without your own safety actually being at stake, that the relationship can survive you having a separate internal state from theirs. Now let's talk about what healthy detachment actually looks like, because the word detachment carries so much baggage that people often reject the entire concept before they've understood what it actually means. There's a term from contemplative psychology, non-attachment, that captures this far better than the more common Western use of the word detachment, which tends to imply distance, coldness, disengagement. Non-attachment means something almost opposite. It means engaging fully, feeling fully, caring fully, while holding the outcome loosely, without your own sense of stability depending on things unfolding a particular way. Think about the difference between a lifeguard and a bystander watching someone struggle in water. The bystander, who is fused with the panic in the scene, often freezes, overwhelmed, unable to act clearly because their own nervous system has become indistinguishable from the emergency itself. The lifeguard, trained specifically to stay differentiated even in crisis, feels the urgency, completely moves with real speed and real care, and still maintains enough separateness to think clearly, to act effectively, to actually help rather than simply mirror the panic back into the situation. Nobody would call the lifeguard cold. The lifeguard is, in that moment, the most genuinely useful, most genuinely present person in the entire scene, precisely because they didn't drown alongside the person they were trying to save. This is the model worth aiming for in ordinary emotional life. Not becoming a bystander who feels nothing, and not becoming someone who drowns every time someone near you struggles, but becoming someone capable of staying in the water, fully engaged, fully caring, without losing the specific clarity that actually makes you useful to the people you love. Let's get concrete about what this looks like in practice, because understanding the concept is only useful if it changes how you actually move through your next difficult conversation. The first shift involves something almost deceptively simple: learning to notice the exact moment a feeling stops being about the other person and starts being entirely about you. This sounds abstract until you practice it, and then it becomes remarkably clear. Someone you love is venting about a hard day, and somewhere in the conversation your own chest tightens, your own thoughts start spinning, your own mood has quietly shifted to match theirs entirely. That moment, the moment your internal state stops tracking their experience and starts becoming a second, independent copy of it, is the exact moment fusion has occurred. Simply noticing it, without judgment, without trying to force yourself back to neutral immediately, is often enough to begin loosening its grip. Awareness interrupts automation the same way a single breath interrupts a spiraling thought, not by force but by creating just enough space for choice to re-enter the process. The second shift involves a specific mental habit worth building deliberately, something close to internal narration. When you feel yourself starting to merge with someone else's emotional state, silently naming what's happening can create real separation almost instantly. Not a dramatic internal speech, just a quiet, factual observation. This is their pain. not mine. I can be here for this without becoming this. That sentence, repeated internally in moments of fusion, does something almost mechanical to the nervous system. It reintroduces the boundary that fusion had quietly dissolved, not by suppressing the feeling, but by correctly relocating its source. The third shift is more structural, and it involves examining your own definition of what being a good friend, partner, or family member actually requires. Many people who struggle with fusion carry an unspoken belief that truly caring means feeling exactly what the other person feels, matching their intensity precisely, as though anything less would be a kind of betrayal. This belief deserves to be questioned directly because it isn't actually true, and holding it produces enormous, unnecessary suffering. The people who are most genuinely helpful in a crisis are rarely the ones who match the crisis's intensity. They're the ones who bring something steadier into the room, a kind of ballast that the person in distress can borrow from precisely because it isn't currently being consumed by the same storm. Here's a twist worth sitting with because it inverts something most people assume without ever examining it. The belief that intense emotional mirroring equals deep love often produces relationships that feel intense but don't actually hold up well over time. Because two people locked in constant emotional fusion tend to destabilize each other rather than support each other, each one's distress amplifying the other's in a feedback loop that neither person fully controls. Relationships built on differentiation instead, where both people can stay present with each other's pain without losing their own footing, tend to be far more durable, precisely because there's always at least one stable point in the system, even during the hardest moments. This pattern shows up with unusual clarity in caregiving professions, where the stakes of fusion versus differentiation become almost impossible to ignore. Consider two nurses working the same demanding unit. One absorbs every patient's fear and every family's grief so completely that by the end of a shift she can barely function, carrying the emotional residue of a dozen different crises home with her every single night. Unable to separate what happened at work from her own internal state long after her shift has ended, the other feels every bit as much compassion in the moment, genuinely not performing detachment as some kind of professional armor, but has built enough internal separateness that she can be fully present with a frightened patient, offer real comfort, and still walk out at the end of her shift relatively intact, ready to be present for her own family rather than depleted by someone else's crisis all over again. Over years, these two nurses tend to have dramatically different outcomes. And the difference has nothing to do with how much either of them actually cares. The first nurse, however devoted, is at serious risk of what researchers call compassion fatigue, a specific kind of burnout that emerges not from caring too little, but from caring in a way that offers no internal boundary, no valve, no separation between witnessing suffering and absorbing it entirely as your own. The second nurse, paradoxically, often sustains her capacity for genuine compassion far longer, precisely because that compassion isn't constantly draining a well that never gets the chance to refill. This distinction matters far beyond formal caregiving professions, because in some sense, everyone who loves deeply is doing a version of this work constantly, in friendships, in families, in romantic partnerships. The parent managing a child's meltdown, the friend supporting someone through a divorce, the adult child navigating an aging parent's decline. All of them face the exact same fork in the road that the two nurses face, whether to fuse completely with the suffering in front of them or to remain differentiated enough to actually be useful across the full duration the situation requires, which is often much longer than a single dramatic moment of crisis. Let's talk about a fear that tends to surface the moment people start practicing this because it's worth addressing directly rather than pretending it isn't real. If I stop absorbing everyone's emotions so completely, will I become less caring? Will the people I love notice a difference? And will that difference feel, to them, like abandonment? There's an old philosophical framework worth borrowing here. because it captures this exact challenge with unusual precision, despite being thousands of years old. Stoic philosophy draws a sharp line between what lies within your control and what doesn't, and it argues somewhat counterintuitively that peace of mind comes specifically from investing your full energy into the first category while releasing your grip on the second. Applied to emotional life, this means something quite specific. You can fully control your own effort, your own presence, your own honesty and care towards someone who's struggling. You cannot control their internal experience, their reaction, whether your support actually relieves their pain or not. Fusion happens precisely at the point where people stop respecting that line where they start treating someone else's emotional outcome as though it were within their control, as though enough absorption, enough worry, enough matched distress could somehow guarantee the other person's healing. This isn't cruelty. It usually comes from love, twisted slightly by the mistaken belief that caring harder produces better outcomes for the person you're caring about. But emotional outcomes rarely work that way. A friend's grief resolves on its own timeline, shaped by countless factors entirely outside your control, and you're matching that grief intensity for intensity doesn't actually speed anything up or make it more bearable for them. What tends to help, based on both clinical research and simple lived experience, is steady differentiated presence, someone who stays close without drowning alongside them, someone whose own stability offers something solid to lean against precisely because it hasn't been swept away by the same current. The honest answer is that some difference will be noticeable, and for people used to your old pattern of total fusion, that difference may initially feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. But here's what tends to happen once the adjustment period passes. The people who actually benefit from your presence during hard times, rather than simply from your total emotional absorption of their pain, tend to experience the differentiated version of you as more helpful, not less. You show up with actual clarity instead of matching chaos. You can offer perspective instead of simply amplifying distress. You remain capable of holding space for someone precisely because you haven't disappeared into the same emotional flood they're currently standing in. The people who like the old fused version of you, specifically because it meant you'd absorb their distress without requiring anything of them in return, who relied on your total emotional merger as a kind of unpaid labor, may indeed experience your new differentiation as a loss. That reaction is worth paying attention to, not because it means you're doing something wrong, but because it reveals something honest about what that particular relationship was actually built on. Now let's address the other side of this, because this entire conversation risks tipping into something unhealthy if it isn't handled carefully. There's a version of protecting yourself from fusion that curdles into something else entirely. A kind of preemptive numbness that mistakes disconnection for safety. This is worth naming clearly because a significant number of people who start this work, especially after years of painful overinvolvement, swing too far in the other direction, building walls so thorough that almost nothing gets through anymore, including the connection and warmth they actually wanted all along. This overcorrection often masquerades as progress because it does genuinely reduce the exhausting cycle of absorption and depletion. But numbness isn't the same achievement as differentiation, even though they can look similar from the outside for a while. Differentiation lets feeling in fully and lets you remain yourself while feeling it. Numbness keeps feeling out entirely, which does technically prevent fusion, the same way refusing to leave your house technically prevents car accidents. It solves the problem by eliminating the entire domain the problem existed in, at a cost far greater than the problem itself. You'll know you've drifted from healthy detachment into numbness if certain things start happening. Moments that should move you, genuinely happy news from someone you love, genuinely sad news from someone you love, start registering as strangely flat, distant, observed rather than felt. Physical intimacy or closeness starts feeling like performance rather than presence. You notice yourself narrating your own life from slightly outside it, watching rather than living, evaluating rather than experiencing. These are worth taking seriously, not as signs you failed at detachment, but as signs the pendulum has swung further than intended, and it's worth deliberately practicing letting feeling back in small, manageable doses, the same way you deliberately practice pulling back from fusion in the opposite direction. It helps to understand why this overcorrection happens so often, because it isn't simply bad luck or poor execution. Numbness offers an immediate, powerful relief from the exhaustion of chronic fusion. And immediate relief is always seductive, especially after years of feeling perpetually overwhelmed by everyone else's emotional weather. The nervous system, given the option between continued flooding and a wall thick enough to stop the flooding entirely, will often choose the wall not because it's the healthiest long-term option, but because it's the fastest available route out of an unbearable ongoing state. Recognizing this tendency in advance makes it far easier to catch yourself mid-overcorrection, adjusting the valve back toward openness deliberately rather than discovering months later that connection itself has started to feel strangely distant and hard to locate. There's a useful metaphor here, one that tends to click for people struggling to hold both sides of this at once. Think of your emotional openness like a valve rather than a switch. A switch is binary, fully open or fully closed, feeling everything or feeling nothing. A valve allows for calibration, letting exactly the right amount through for a given situation. Wide open in moments that call for full presence and full feeling. Narrowed in moments that require you to stay functional rather than overwhelmed. Learning to operate the valve rather than being stuck at one extreme setting or the other is really the entire skill this whole conversation has been circling. There's an overlooked piece of this puzzle worth naming directly, because it explains why so many people who are extraordinarily attuned to other people's emotional states remain almost completely blind to their own. Years spent monitoring everyone else's internal weather leaves very little attention left over for tracking your own. And this isn't a minor side effect, it's often the actual mechanism keeping fusion in place. If you've spent decades becoming an expert at reading a parent's mood, a partner's frustration, a friend's hidden sadness, while receiving very little modeling for how to notice and name your own internal states with that same precision, then of course your attention defaults outward the instant someone else's emotions enter a room. There's no competing signal pulling it back toward yourself because that internal signal was never given the practice it needed to become clear. This is why part of building differentiation involves something that sounds almost unrelated at first, developing a much more precise internal vocabulary for your own emotional states separate from anyone else's. Most people who struggle with fusion can describe in vivid detail exactly what someone else is feeling and why, but stumble when asked to describe their own current internal state with that same specificity. Practicing this pausing periodically throughout an ordinary day to ask simply, "What am I feeling right now?" and pushing past the first vague answer toward something more precise. Tired in what way? Anxious about what specifically? Glad because of what exactly builds the exact muscle that fusion has left chronically underdeveloped. A person who can name their own internal states with real precision has something concrete to return to during someone else's emotional storm. An anchor that people who've never built this vocabulary simply don't have available to them in the moment they need it most. There's also a specific self-compassion component worth naming here, because people who struggle with fusion often extend enormous understanding toward everyone else's difficult emotions while treating their own with something close to contempt. The same person capable of sitting patiently with a friend's anxiety for hours will often respond to their own anxiety with impatience, criticism, a demand to just get over it already. This asymmetry matters more than it seems, because differentiation isn't only about separating your emotional state from other people's. It's also about extending yourself the same quality of attention and care you so readily extend outward. A boundary built entirely from self-discipline, with no accompanying self-compassion, tends to feel harsh and unsustainable, more like punishment than protection. A boundary built with real warmth toward your own experience feels entirely different. Sturdy without being cold, protective without being punitive. Let's talk about a specific practice that helps build this valve deliberately, because understanding the concept intellectually rarely translates into the felt experience of actually being able to do it under pressure. It's a practice sometimes called the third position, borrowed loosely from certain therapeutic traditions. In any emotionally charged interaction, there are at least two positions available to your attention: your own experience and the other person's experience. Most people who struggle with fusion collapse almost entirely into the second position, so thoroughly focused on the other person's internal state that their own disappears from awareness completely. The third position is a kind of observer's vantage point, a part of your attention that can watch both your experience and theirs from slightly outside either one, tracking the interaction as a whole rather than losing yourself inside it. Building access to this third position doesn't require anything mystical. It can be as simple as periodically, silently asking yourself, during a difficult conversation, what am I actually feeling right now, separate from what they're feeling? That question alone, asked honestly and repeatedly, gradually strengthens a kind of internal muscle, the capacity to remain a witness to your own experience even while deeply engaged with someone else's. Over time, this muscle becomes available automatically, without conscious effort, the same way any skill eventually moves from deliberate practice into effortless competence. There's something worth understanding about why this particular skill matters so much beyond the immediate relief it offers in any single conversation. People who can access this third position consistently tend to describe a specific, unexpected side effect, a deepening rather than a lessening of their actual capacity for love. This seems counterintuitive at first, because the entire premise of detachment sounds, on its surface, like it should produce less connection rather than more. But consider what fusion actually costs over time. A person constantly overwhelmed by absorbing everyone else's emotional states has limited capacity left over for genuine curiosity, genuine presence, genuine delight in another person's existence, because so much of their internal resources are perpetually consumed by managing borrowed distress. Differentiation frees up exactly that capacity. It's not a smaller container for love. It's the same container, finally able to hold love instead of constantly leaking it out through an unmanaged boundary. This reframes the entire fear that started this conversation. The worry that detaching will make you someone who loves less has the causality backwards. Fusion, not detachment, is usually what erodes someone's actual capacity to love well over time, because chronic emotional depletion doesn't produce deeper connection, it produces burnout, resentment, and eventually, in many cases, exactly the numbness people were originally trying to avoid by staying so porous in the first place. Real, sustainable love requires two separate, intact people choosing connection repeatedly, not one person dissolving into the other and calling the dissolution intimacy. Let's talk practically about how this actually gets built over time, because none of this happens through a single insight, however clear that insight feels in the moment you have it. It happens through repeated practice, in small, low-stakes situations first, before you ever attempt it in the middle of a genuine crisis. Start with minor emotional weather, a friend's mild frustration about traffic, a partner's irritation about a small inconvenience. In these low-stakes moments, practice noticing your own internal state separately from theirs. Practice the third position question. What am I actually feeling right now? Practice staying warm and present without your own mood shifting entirely to match theirs. These small repetitions matter more than they seem to, because they build the actual neural pathway this entire skill depends on. Long before you ever need to call on it during something that actually matters enormously. Only after this pathway has some real strength should you expect it to hold during genuinely difficult moments, a loved one's real grief, a partner's real grief, a partner's real crisis, a friend's real emergency. Even then, expect some slippage. You will still sometimes fuse completely, lose the third position entirely, come out the other side of a hard conversation feeling as depleted as you always used to. This isn't failure. It's simply evidence that the old pattern was deeply grooved, built over years, and new patterns take real repetition before they can reliably hold under the highest pressure situations. The exact situations where the old pattern is strongest and most automatic. None of this progresses in a straight line, and expecting it to will only add unnecessary discouragement to a process that's already asking a great deal of you. Some weeks the third position will feel almost effortless, available the instant you reach for it. Other weeks, particularly during periods of your own stress or fatigue, the old fusion will reassert itself with surprising force, as though none of the practice had happened at all. Both of these are simply part of how deeply ingrained patterns get rewritten unevenly, with real gains that sometimes look from week to week indistinguishable from no progress at all, even though the underlying trend, measured over months rather than days, is quietly moving in the right direction the entire time. There's a final piece of this worth naming clearly, because it's the piece that determines whether any of this actually produces the outcome you're hoping for. Detachment, done well, was never actually about the other person at all. It was never really a strategy for managing them, their moods, their crises, their emotional weather. It was always, underneath everything else, a practice of returning to yourself, again and again, in the middle of a world that will constantly, understandably, pull your attention outward toward everyone else's experience. It's worth being honest that this practice rarely feels clean or complete in any single moment. There will be conversations even years into practicing this where you fuse completely anyway, where an old familiar wave of someone else's distress simply overtakes you before your third position has any chance to engage, where you come out the other side feeling exactly as depleted as you always used to. This isn't evidence that the work has failed. Old patterns, especially ones built early and reinforced for years, don't disappear through understanding alone. They fade slowly, unevenly, with real progress showing up not as the absence of any slippage, but as slippage that happens less often, resolves more quickly, and no longer defines your entire relationship to the people you love the way it once did. There's also something worth saying about timing, because differentiation isn't a fixed trait you either have or don't, evenly applied across every relationship in your life. Most people find they can access it far more easily with a coworker or acquaintance than with a parent, a partner, or a childhood best friend, precisely because those closer relationships carry the deepest, oldest grooves, the ones fusion first learned to travel along many years before any of your current relationships even existed. Expect this. Expect the differentiated version of yourself to show up more easily in lower-stakes relationships first, and expect the highest-stakes relationships, the ones that matter most, to be the last places this skill fully takes root. Not because you're failing there, but because those are simply the deepest waters requiring the most practice before they can be navigated with real steadiness. This is why the strongest insight in the entire conversation isn't really about the mechanism itself, useful as that mechanism is. It's about what becomes possible once the mechanism starts working, even partially. A version of you capable of loving people fully without being periodically destroyed by that love. A version of you who can sit with someone else's pain, offer real presence, real warmth, real usefulness, and still walk away intact enough to keep showing up the next day and the day after that for years, instead of burning out of the capacity to care at all somewhere along the way. That version of you isn't smaller or colder than the one currently drowning in everyone else's emotional weather. It's simply sustainable, built to last, capable of the kind of steady, decades-long love that constant fusion was never actually able to provide, however intensely it may have felt like love in any single overwhelming moment. This is why the phrase "without losing your heart" matters so much in how this entire question gets framed. The goal was never a smaller heart, a more guarded heart, a heart kept carefully behind glass where nothing could reach it, and nothing could leak out of it either. The goal is a heart that stays fully open precisely because it's finally protected by something sturdier than constant vigilance, a self solid enough that opening doesn't mean disappearing. A person's generous enough to hold someone else's pain without losing track of where you end and they begin. You were never actually too sensitive. You were simply operating without the boundary that would have let all that sensitivity become sustainable instead of exhausting. That boundary isn't coldness. It was never coldness. It's the exact thing that makes it possible to keep showing up fully for the people you love for years instead of burning out of that capacity entirely somewhere along the way. Consider what actually waits on the other side of this practice. Once the valve has been genuinely built rather than merely understood in theory. Conversations where you can offer real comfort without leaving depleted. Relationships where your presence feels steady rather than volatile, dependable rather than either overwhelming or absent. A capacity to witness someone you love in real pain, stay close through all of it, and still have something left over for your own life once the moment has passed. None of that requires loving anyone less. It requires only that the love finally has somewhere solid to stand while it does its work. The heart you're trying to protect was never in danger from staying open. It was in danger from having no edges at all. Give it edges now, gently, deliberately, one small practiced moment at a time, and watch how much more of it becomes available for the people who actually deserve to receive it, including, finally, after everything, you.